So we start these like we don't know what we're doing, but we are well into the Not an Accident podcast. Welcome back, everybody. We're in front of a live studio, not so much, but we are here right now at the Modern Media Studios, and very excited to have Sterling Lovelady, one of my good friends and a fantastic divorce and family law attorney in the Tampa Bay area. So welcome, my friend. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on, man. I've been looking forward to it. I've been watching the podcast, and I've been excited to get on.
So I was excited to have you. So when I first started the podcast, I was like, I'm never going to have an attorney on here because I have so many attorney friends and things like that. I wanted to be fair to everybody. I wanted to be cool. But I'm part of a couple like Facebook groups like Florida Attorney Advice and stuff like that. 90% of I wouldn't say 90, probably 80% of the questions have to do with family law, and then another large chunk have to do with like evictions and real estate. So I said, I started this because I wanted to help my audience and I wanted to give them some context. And I was like, I gotta have a family law attorney on. So who do I call? And I called you. So to all my other lawyer friends out there, I still love you and I'm sorry, but Sterling whispered sweet nothings and was very convincing. So here we are. Tell me about yourself.
Yeah, so longtime Florida resident. I grew up in the Panhandle of Florida. Went to Florida State. If you know me, that was kind of my claim to fame. I played football at Florida State. I was there during the national championship run in 2013.
Nice.
And then after that, I was a little lost, to be honest, of what to do. I mean, that was my only plan. And so then I just decided to go to law school right after I got done playing ball. Growing up, my dad's very blue collar, right? Worked on cars. I grew up around racetracks and cars. And my dad always told me, just be a lawyer. You can do whatever you want, right? You can work on the cars on the weekend. So that was my plan. Had no idea what I was going to do. Ended up going to Stetson Law in St. Pete. And here I am. I have two young children, 4 and 6, that are both adopted. Really incredible story of their adoption. And this year I've been married 10 years to
Congratulations.
a woman who's way out of my league. So
we're in the same boat then with that. I'm in the same boat. Yeah, we're going 5 years married. And I think, it'll be 6 in November. And yes, 100% out of my league. And I love you, Mrs. Sullivan. So that's amazing. So how did you get involved? So your partner at your firm at NLG Law, how did you get involved in family law and practicing that area of law?
Sort of by accident, to be honest. I did a lot of things I end up not liking. So when I first got into law school, I thought I was going to do something in the sports industry. That was kind of all I've ever done. Thought about being an agent. I went and worked for a big corporation who does triathlons and just didn't find anything I liked. I tried environmental law, which paid great, but bored me to death.
Yeah.
And so then I ended up taking a family law course in law school. And things worked out to where my professor ended up being the partner at a firm and offered me a job. And so I kind of fell into it. And then I loved it. My goal was always to help people. And I thought that was going to be criminal law. After interning at the state attorney's office, I ended up hating that. And so I wanted to find a way to really help people day to day. And family law is the best way to do that, in my opinion. I meet people every day at the worst time of their life, similar to you. But this is a crisis that's been ongoing, right? Usually in someone's life. So that's sort of how I ended up there.
That's very interesting that you were at the state attorney's office. I have a lot of friends who were at the state attorney's office and they loved it. The only thing they hated was the pay, which I think they finally increased. So you got involved in family law. We're just going to get right into the hard questions. And don't judge me to my other guests, but I gave Sterling a little bit of heads up because obviously with attorney-client privilege and stuff like that, we have to ask things a little bit differently. So what is a common reason, or what are the top reasons that you see that people end up filing for divorce?
I think the top reason, and I plan on writing a book about this one day. Everyone asks me that. I think the number one reason, it can be boiled down to this. In your marriage, if you choose something other than your spouse, it will lead to a divorce. Insert the blank. I got divorced because I chose blank over my spouse, whether that's money, whether that's another person, right? Someone else you found, whether that's your job, whether that's a hobby. It could even be your kids. Right? If you put something else between you and your spouse, it will ultimately lead to separation and distance between the two of you. And then a lot of people end up in my office that way. Believe it or not, it's not the major problems. It's not usually infidelity. It's not usually bankruptcy or something like that. It's usually just incremental things that happen during the marriage, taking your focus off of your spouse and putting it on something else.
I have a very good friend of mine who's a doctor buddy. Shout out Dr. Vlad. And he's given me a lot of good advice over the years. And one of the things that he told me, that you have to keep dating your significant other.
Absolutely.
You have to keep the spark alive. And he was like, listen, you need to pick a time, whether it's quarterly, whether it's, every couple months, whatever, where you and your significant other just go spend some time together.
Absolutely.
And just, enjoy each other. So that's very interesting, because you would think that it's a lot of the bigger things like, oh yeah, like, money troubles, like that's typically it, but it's really just choosing something, insert blank, over the other person. So what are some, I guess, red flags that you'll see maybe that's type of occurring? And then I guess to follow up to that, how would you kind of correct those? Communication maybe?
Yeah, communication is big. I always ask everyone if they've been to counseling. If they haven't been to counseling, I encourage them to go to counseling. I tell a lot of my clients when I talk to them, look, I don't need your business. I would be happy to help you, but I have a lot of people that are willing to.
There's no lack of business out there.
There's no lack of business. So I'm in no hurry to get them through the door. I always ask them if they've been to counseling. I ask them different questions to make sure they're really ready to go through this process, because although most people leave my office happier than when they came in, there is a period of time where I'm sure a lot of people question, did I make the right decision, right? Because you're going to have to choose the hard thing, right? You're going to have to choose being married and being dedicated to your spouse, raising good children. That's hard. Getting divorced, that's hard, right? So in terms of red flags, I'd say, just like you pointed out, if you stop dating your spouse, right, you start making it transactional, that's a big red flag. You start separating money, start hiding money, that's a big red flag. You start spending time with someone else, right? Start spending a lot of time at the office or with your buddies, that's a red flag. Again, it's whatever takes your focus off of your spouse and onto something else, that's the flag usually.
And we're not saying that, to avoid these pitfalls, you shouldn't have fun. You shouldn't have other activities and other interests, because that also keeps the relationship healthy as well. But I get exactly what you're saying, that it's when you start noticing these, I guess, snowball effect, for lack of better terms, maybe it's something that you guys need to sit down and discuss with one another, because, you put a lot of time in this relationship, the courting process, the dating process, the engagement, the wedding, and then years of your life together, what would you say, and this is kind of a hard, kind of a sensitive question, what would you say to somebody that, we stayed together because of the kids?
I'd say you're not alone. I met with someone yesterday who told me that, and I said, look, I've never tried to convince anyone to get divorced. I'm not in the business of convincing people to get divorced. I'm in the business of helping people strategically get out of their marriage if that's what they want to do. But when someone tells me I stayed together for the kids, I would tell them, is that really the healthiest thing you could do? And sometimes it is. Sometimes there are kids in very vulnerable situations where you need to put on a good face, help them get to a certain point in their life where they can be successful. But there are also situations where it's more detrimental to the children, right? Where all they're seeing is two parents fighting. That's not healthy. So it depends on the circumstances. But I've had cases where people told me they have 5 children and they wanted to leave after the first. So people will continue to have children.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, people think children will make it better. And in my experience...
Lucky number 5. It'll get better this time.
Lucky number 5. Yeah. So in my own personal life, having 2 children and in doing divorces day to day, what I would tell you is children are going to magnify whatever is going on in your relationship already. If it's fantastic, they will make it better. If it's really bad, it will magnify those problems, and it will only create more chaos in your life.
Having 2 kids as well, I have 4.5-month-old going on 5 months, and then a 3.5-year-old. And luckily, we've been we've been on the uptick, the good direction. We've been very, very fortunate. But I get what you're saying. It's if you're already stressed, you're already fighting, you're already having issues. Adding a child that you're responsible for to basically serve their needs, yes, will significantly magnify that. And I can definitely attest to the stress that adds to a household. Good stress.
Right.
But it's going to cause difficulties if there's already difficulties that are there, or magnify those.
Right.
How do you, and I know this is probably in your practice area more important than anything else, how do you maintain expectations with such, we'll say, sensitive clients?
Experience, first of all, right? Being in the courtroom, having done hundreds of divorce cases, it's helpful to know what the potential outcomes are, right? So early in my career, it was difficult. Because what the statute says you're entitled to and what actually happens in court are 2 different things.
We've been there, yeah.
So just the experience of being able to explain to people, look, I know you think you're going to get X, Y, and Z, and you might. Or you might spend $50,000 in attorney's fees to get there, and then was it really worth it, right? So from day one, I set expectations, and before I take a client, I need to know what their expectations are. Recently, for example, I had a potential client, and he told me a list of things he wanted, and I said, look, if those are the things you want, I'm not the lawyer for you. And they said, well, why not? And I said, well, I can't get those things for you, and I'm not confident that you're going to get good value for your money here because I don't think those things are worth fighting for. And that's just the way I practice, right? I'm going in, taking reasonable positions, fighting hard for clients, but also making sure that their expectations are set. Very rarely do I have a client who is shocked by a result, right? And I think you may have experienced this, but I've seen it a lot in court where something happens, a judge rules on something, and someone sitting in the courtroom absolutely stunned, had no idea this was a possible outcome. And so it's lots of conversations from the very first time I speak to them throughout the entire case of, hey, here's the range of options that could happen in this case. If you settle, you may end up in the middle. If you go to court, you may end up on one end or the other.
We have these conversations all the time because, we had the recent law changes with, 2023 with tort reform. And then we've had all these different changes now with the mandatory disclosures with now filing suits, in 2025. So, and then new bad faith, laws, and there's a lot of moving parts with what we do. So I have cases right now where I'm perfectly honest with clients and say, listen, I may not even, especially with the, we have, not to get into the intricacies of the law, but there's a 90-day, period where they can evaluate the case. And if there's multiple parties, then we go to, potential, there's a legal action known as interpleader to divide up the money. It gets messy, folks. Yeah. But long story short, I have a couple of those cases that are kind of going the distance now, those newer cases that are very nuanced. And I'm like, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. This could be the outcome, but there's no case law. And I know, 50 people in the plaintiff's bar in Tampa Bay. Nobody's dealt with this. I'm sitting around with 4 attorneys last night at an event. One of them is board certified to my right. The other one is probably been practicing for 30 years. And I talked to them about an issue that they have, and they're like, we've never heard of that. We're interested to see how it goes.
Right.
So, and I think you have to, if you're confident enough and you have the experience as an attorney, you have to be comfortable with saying that. Like, right. This could happen, but, this may be uncharted waters as well. The second thing that I'll tell you with what you said is I've been doing a lot of content on this recently, so don't hate on me, other lawyer friends. But to your point, be very cautious of an attorney that's like, I need a $10,000 retainer. That list looks good. I'll get you everything you want.
Right.
And be careful, and we'll get into it in a lot more detail as far as what you're fighting for, because you need to look at basically the time value of money, how much time it's going to get there and how much you're going to lose. If you're hell-bent on getting that toaster, I'm like, I don't care, and it costs you $20,000 to get that toaster, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road, was that toaster really worth it?
Right.
And
yeah, I've had those very conversations, right? Literally over the kitchen table. Well, I love that table. I want the table. Okay, how much did you pay for the table? $1,500. Okay, well, if we sit here for 3 more hours and argue over it, you can buy another table yourself. Well, I don't want another table. I want that one. And so I have those conversations throughout the entire process. Look, you can pay me or you can pay the other person. And if paying the other person gets this done, I would rather you pay them, because then you're done, right? And a lot of people selfishly would rather go to court. But a good one, I tell a lot of my clients, and you can steal this if you want. I asked them, I said, do you know why we have case law? And they say, no, most people don't know. I said, because a judge at some point got it wrong. That's why it's there. So one of the possibilities, if you end up in court, is that a judge decides the wrong outcome. And then you have to appeal it. And then the appellate court decides, was the judge right or wrong? And so I don't think that comes to mind.
And that's expensive.
That's very expensive. And so I tell them, look, here's what I think would happen, but also there's an outlier. The judge is just wrong. Yeah. Sometimes that happens.
It does. And, we deal with juries all the time. And I tell people, listen, when you go into court and you're arguing, a lot of the cases that we take, are, either multi-6-figure or even 7-figure cases that we're just so far apart we can't get it done. They see it one way, we see it another. You're picking 6 people to sit on a jury that you would find in 7-Eleven that weren't smart enough to get out of jury duty.
Right.
That's what you're putting your faith in. But to your point, another analogy that I use, sometimes when people aren't collectible, and it happens in our business a lot, and they have low coverage, a 10,000 policy or 25 policy, they go, I only get 25. I'm only settling my case for $25,000. I want to go after them personally. And then I go through what insurance is and stuff like that. And then I go through my explanation and I say, listen, I said, I could go right now. I could spend 2 to 3 years litigating your case. I said, we have to hire experts because we can't testify to the things that we're going to be saying. So we have to hire doctors, experts, things like that are going to say what your injuries are, what they'll cost in the future, et cetera, right? It's very expensive, anywhere from, call it $40,000 to $150,000, depending on the expert. And that comes out of the settlement. And then I said on top of that, we go in front of a jury, which we, again, use my jury analogy, and then maybe we get you $250,000, $500,000, $1 million. And they're usually like $1 million. That's what I'm talking about. And then I go and say, here's your $1 million, nice shiny piece of paper. And they're like, when do I get my check? And I'm like, no. We have to go after that person that only has a $10,000 policy and no assets according to this affidavit. And oh, by the way, they're going to file bankruptcy about 5 seconds later. So sadly, and then we go into the uninsured motorist conversation. We talked about it a little bit. I'm going to switch gears. How do you value, I guess, for lack of better terms, non-tangible assets? So we use the example of influencers and celebrities and that brand. So how do you value those things? Like, I have 1 million followers on Instagram. How do you get that figure?
Yeah, so this being a very new thing, right? The case law takes years to catch up.
Of course.
So there is no precedent for how do you value someone's Instagram account with 10 million followers, for example. And I've had this very scenario.
You carry the two and you divide,
Right, and so here's the thing. What is that worth in the hands of the person who runs the account? It's worth a lot. Can you sell it? I don't know. Could you? Maybe. What can another person make with that? Here's the distinction, and again, getting down into the weeds here a little bit. In Florida, when you value a business, there are two components. There is personal goodwill and there's enterprise goodwill. And so any personal goodwill is not a marital asset. So any value I bring, for example, if you're a doctor, right, and you have a small practice and you practice alone and they value your practice. Well, if you leave the practice, it's worth nothing. There's no doctor there. It's worth whatever the computers and the desks are worth. And a lot of people are shocked by that. And so a medical practice in a divorce may be worth $10,000, even though it makes $500,000 a year after taxes. And so that is the same problem with an influencer, right? So they say you make $1 million a year as an influencer on Instagram. Well, the issue is what portion of that value is attributed to your personality and people following the account because of you. And there's a good likelihood that it's a high portion of it, right? So that's where it becomes very difficult to evaluate what's it worth. An easier example, it would be a sales business, right? You have inventory, and if you're not buying a product because of the person who owns the business, then most of that is going to be a marital asset. That's the corporate goodwill. But anytime you're going to a business because of the person that owns it, that is what we call personal goodwill, and that's excluded from marital assets.
Wow. Okay. When you're valuing these businesses, what does that process look like? Meaning, are you looking at financial records? Are you hiring experts? How does that kind of go through that with us?
Yeah, in most cases,
let me rephrase that. We're not in court. I'm just kidding. How do you value any assets in a divorce? You know what I mean? Because like we used a table analogy. That could be grandma's table.
Right.
You know what I mean? That was fourth generation table.
Right. Well, it depends on the complexity of the case with everything. If you can afford to hire an expert to evaluate every asset, well, then you could do that, right? You could evaluate the jewelry. You could take it to an expert, look at the price of the jewelry. Some of the better examples, the more common examples would be real estate, right? We had a real estate appraiser. They appraise the property, and then you can either agree with the value or you can dispute the value. In most cases, personal property is never valued, right? The kayaks you have in your garage and the kitchen table and the pots and pans, we just agree to split those up, right? We divide those evenly. But when it comes to a business, most of the time we have a business valuation expert, a CPA, someone involved to look at the books. And there's a couple different methods, but it's either based on your gross revenues or your assets within the business. So again, going to the doctor example, that's usually the most extreme, where they've been living a doctor lifestyle throughout their marriage, they're driving nice cars, they got a nice home, and then you have to tell them, yes, but it's all attributed to the person, right? The only value there is in the person, and that's not a marital asset, unfortunately. And there are other ways to compensate for that. But valuing assets is often a fight because someone says, well, we paid X amount for that item. We paid $10,000 for that TV. and I have to tell them, well, we need to value it at a goodwill price.
Cool. It's worth $1,500 on Facebook Marketplace.
Right. I tell people when I ask them in their initial consultation, I say, think about an estate sale. If you have an estate sale, what are people buying and how much are they paying for it? Because that's the reality of how it's valued in a divorce.
When you're talking about divorces, everybody has a different opinion on the law, because they hear California and the celebrity divorces and they hear this and that. So I did some research because I don't know a lot about family law. Believe it or not, not all lawyers know everything. It is a equitable distribution state, but it starts at 50%. So or 50-50 rather. So go into that.
Yeah. So it's called equitable distribution, not equal distribution.
Correct.
And so we have to make that distinction. Like you said, in most cases, it's 50-50. The interesting thing in Florida is that in order to determine the marital assets, it's all about time and it's not about title. So from the day you get married till the day you file for divorce, that's how we determine what's marital. So for example, you have a bank account or a retirement account in your name. From the day you get married, any contributions you make to that account are marital. And that's usually the first shock, usually the first phone call.
That's my money.
Right, that's my money. And I say, well, what assets are out there? And they say, oh, nothing together. I say, okay, well, let's talk about this. Do you have a retirement account? Yes. Well, have you been contributing to it?
Of
Yes.
course.
Of course. And that's a marital asset. And they say, what do you mean? It's in my name. And so there are ways to get an unequal distribution, right? More than 50% or less than 50%. And that's usually reserved for cases where one person comes into the marriage with substantial assets and they use those assets to increase the marital assets. And so the court can do equity, right? We like to call it a court of equity in family law, although it doesn't always feel like that. But the judge has some discretion to say, okay, you came into this marriage with $10 million and the other person had zero. It's not fair for you each to walk away with $5 million, right? Let's look at the assets, look what existed before the marriage, look what was created during the marriage, and try to see if we can create a fair outcome.
How hard is it to represent, and God bless them, homemakers, people that are raising the kids and things like that? Why the other significant other is at or spouse rather is at work.
Every family law attorney want the moneyed spouse, right? And if they tell you otherwise, they're lying, right? Because it's just easier, right?
Yeah.
It's what assets are out there, they can pay your fees, that sort of thing. But again, 50% of that work is on the spouse's side who has stayed at home. And the interesting thing about those cases is usually if you have a stay-at-home spouse in 2025, that means one person is making quite a substantial income, right? In order to afford for one person to stay home.
Absolutely.
And so generally in those cases, you have to wait to get your fees paid. That's the difficult part because it may be that the moneyed spouse has all the money in their retirement accounts, their investment accounts, their bank accounts, but the spouse who's been staying at home with the kids has nothing, right? They've never had to, right? They have a credit card, they swipe it, it gets paid off. That's all they've had to worry about. And so that's the first obstacle is making sure they have sufficient funds to pay attorney's fees to fight. And Florida is quite fair in terms of attorney's fees. We can recover attorney's fees, but it's never guaranteed.
Of course.
So you have to be reasonable still, right? You have to have a reasonable hourly rate, a reasonable fee, but that's the first obstacle. And then the second obstacle is determining the assets and liabilities. Usually the spouse who stays at home just isn't as involved, right? They're raising children or taking care of the home. And so it can be difficult when you sit down and you say, okay, what assets and liabilities are out there? And they say, well, we have a nice house and we live well, but I don't know. So it can be hunting down the assets, hunting down the income from the other side.
Tell me about switching gears a little bit from the marriage side to the unmarriage side or the engagement period. And I've seen this a lot of times in questions. Two different sides of this. And I wanted you to talk about your opinion on the cautions to these two examples. Number one is I moved in with my significant other. They own the house, but I'm helping pay the mortgage. Can you be the bearer of bad news and tell them what that means when the relationship may not work out?
Yeah, well, that means you're paying rent.
Yes.
Right? That it's a glorified rent. So, yeah, there are a lot of issues with moving in with someone before you're married. Personal beliefs aside, legally, you move in with someone, they own the house, you're not on the deed, you're paying their mortgage. You're no different than a renter who's occupying a bedroom in their house. And some people are together for 10 years before they're married, and then the marriage may only last 2 years. And then they say, well, we've been together for 12 years. I've been paying the mortgage for 12 years, and I have to explain to them, well, you're only going to get credit for 2 of those years because you weren't married. So that's why it is very important. If you're going to make financial commitments with someone, you're going to buy a house, you're going to move in together, you need to be sure that that's something you want to do long term. And getting married secures those rights in Florida.
And I've had this secondary conversation, and please feel free to expand, as far as the two people that are not married that decide to buy a house together. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, well, I don't have to sell the house. And it's like, no. You own this together. Yeah. You do have to sell. You're either selling or you're buying that other person out. This isn't like a divorce proceeding.
Right. Well, it's similar, right? So I tell people, if you're not married and you own a house, you're business partners, period. It's no different than you and I buying a house. We own 50% interest. We have to share the bills, things like that. And once you get divorced, again, if you still own the home that you owned while you were married, you're business partners again. And so in those scenarios, if a house is going to be sold, the problem now, especially in today's market, is a lot of people have those 20/20 rates. They have those 3% mortgages that everyone loved so much, 2.5%. And the monthly cost is $3,000 a month, for example. And if they have to refinance it, it's $5,000 a month, and they can't afford it. So now no one wants to leave the home.
That's interesting. Okay.
So the next problem is then that often leads to domestic violence situations, right? Where the cops are called and one person is kicked out of the house. And there are a lot of issues with buying property with someone, making financial commitments with someone before you're married. And that's just one of them.
Go into a little bit more detail with the pettiness and how we kind of touched on it a little bit, but how do you explain that? I guess, do you explain it in time terms? Do you explain it in monetary terms? How do you kind of go through that conversation? Because obviously, there's a lot of emotions involved and frustrations.
Yeah, there are a lot of emotions involved. And when I get frustrated by it, I have to remind myself that the people that I represent are in crisis. Right, they're going through the worst time of their life. If I get a midnight email from someone who's upset, who wants me to do something that I've already talked to them about not doing, I have to remind myself again, they're staying up at night, they're in crisis mode, and so again, tempering those expectations helps. But in terms of the pettiness, I tell someone if they want me to do something that I don't think is a good idea, if I have a good faith basis for doing it and they want to do it right, they want me to depose their grandmother, they want me to depose the uncle or the babysitter. I told them, I don't think that's necessary. If you want me to do it, you're going to have to pay the fees, right? And that's a situation where I have to tell them, look, you may not recover these fees because I don't think this is absolutely necessary. So if they're willing to pay the price and I have a good faith basis for it, I will do it.
Of course.
But I'm not going to do anything in bad faith, even if they want. That's when we have the conversation of ending my representation. And sometimes the pettiness gets to that level. And I have to tell them, look, I don't think I'm the lawyer for you. If these are the actions you want to take, you can do those on your own, but if you want me to represent you, that's not something I'm going to do. For example, I've had people say, well, you need to tell the judge X, Y, and Z. And I say, I'm not going to say that. If you want me to terminate my representation and you tell the judge that, I don't think it's going to work out well for you. But I'm certainly not going to say that.
And I say this with all sensitivity when I say this, but I'm sure you have to deal with a lot as well of, well, I love them, but they cheated on me. They ruined this. Why do I have to pay them?
Exactly. And
in the eyes of the court and the eyes of the law, it's kind of like...
Right. That is a conversation I try to have in the very beginning. Florida is a no-fault state. There are very unfortunate circumstances where your spouse cheats on you and then you have to pay them alimony. It's not fair. It's just not. But being a no-fault state, you can't blame the person. You can't take away the rights they have simply because they were the one that ended the relationship for whatever reason. And so being a no-fault state does make that easier, in my opinion, because someone wants to tell me what happened, all the drama. At the beginning, I try to take it in, make notes so that I can reference it later. I want to understand what they're going through. But at some point, I tell them, look, I understand it's a lot of tension here. There's a lot of emotions, but we need to focus on the facts. We need to focus on the important part. I'm not negating your feelings, but we need to focus on the law and the outcome of the case.
You don't have to answer this directly, so you can use whatever verbiage you would like to. Yeah. How much do you think a divorce, if it goes to distance, if it goes to maybe a trial, how much do you think, or if you want to go through different steps in the process, how much does a divorce cost?
Yeah, so that's the number one question I get, right? How much is this going to cost?
A lot.
Right, a lot. And how long is it going to take? And my favorite answer is as much as you want to spend and as long as you want it to take. So I've done divorces from start to finish in 3 weeks. And that's two people that come to me and say, look, we've worked out everything. We have agreed upon every term. I draft up an agreement, we give it to the judge, we're done. Believe it or not, you can still do that in today's dollars for less than $5,000. $5,000 is probably the minimum. There are people out there that may do it for less, but I can't.
Good luck to them. Yeah.
Good luck. And there are solo practitioners and people that keep their costs down, and maybe you can do it for less. Personally, I don't take a retainer that's less than $5,000. Beyond that, once you go from two people who agree on everything to anything more, you have to look at the steps along the way and decide, is this worth it? Because the next step is usually going to a mediation where you have a neutral mediator who's helping you negotiate, and you're looking anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000, $20,000 if you go through that process.
Prep, mediation.
Yeah.
After, yeah.
Yeah. Financial disclosures, meetings, prep, things like that. Most cases settle at mediation. Mm-hmm. I would say most divorces are done for sub $20,000 in fees on each side. Mm-hmm. If there's good lawyers involved.
Each side.
On
okay.
each side.
Yeah.
If they're thorough, right? If there's only one lawyer involved and everything's agreed upon, again, that's the best way to keep the cost down. The problem is, like we talked about previously, if you have two people who decide, this is too expensive, it can cost you substantially more.
We're going to get
down
into that.
The road.
Yeah.
And so then you go into the next step of, okay, we didn't settle at mediation. Now we have to start getting valuations of properties and assets and businesses. That's when you start getting up into the six-figure range. And so I've had cases that were
on each side.
On each side, yeah. I've had cases that were $150,000 plus in just my fees. We have expert fees who are $50,000 plus. You have mediators fees, all of those things. And so it's not uncommon for people to spend over $200,000 on each side after it's all said and done. And I've seen case law where they spent almost $1 million in attorney's fees between both parties. And so I do explain those scenarios to my clients, and a lot of people just think that's insane. But by the time you're 24 months into litigation, it's really not that insane. And if you look at those types of cases where you're spending six figures, there's multi-million dollars of assets. And so there's something worth fighting for. Personally, I'm the kind of lawyer, if there is $10,000 and it's going to cost $10,000 to argue over it, I'm not arguing over it. I just won't do it because I'm not going to go into court, put my name on the line for a judge to say, are we really arguing over this amount? Why can't we resolve this? So
I tell people all the time, I get the small claims calls, I call them, and the county court calls and things, hey, the asset or this note or something like that. And typically I tell people, I don't even do that type of work anyway, but typically I tell people, listen, if you're under 50 grand and you're trying to fight the good fight, probably not worth it, and maybe just chalk it up as a business decision or try to come to some type of agreement. Or I'll tell them to go to small claims court. The clerk will help you, and it's kind of like Judge Judy. People have to, I understand emotions are high, and I want the audience to know, and forgive me for saying this because it's your lives at the end of the day, but really, when you're going through this process, really, really think about the long-term effects on this, and then 3, 5, 10 years down the road, are you really going to think about this? Are you really going to think about that toaster? Are you really going to think about that dining room table and things?
Yeah. And the one thing people don't think about is the money, obviously, everyone thinks about. Mm-hmm. How much is it going to cost? They want to know each month, how much is it going to cost?
What's my bill?
What's the bill going to be? But the part you don't think about is the time and the emotional toll, right? I've had people tell me that's worse than what they've spent.
Yeah.
Right? Because you can spend 2 years litigating a divorce case easily. If you don't agree, the problem with our court system is it's overwhelmed. A lot of our judges have 500 to 700 cases on their docket at a time. And so if I want to go to court, it may be 6 or 9 months before I can get in front of a judge. And so I tell them, okay, that's fine. If you want to go fight this, you have a good basis for it, let's go. Are you prepared to spend the next 6 or 9 months of your life preparing for this? And if you are, great, let's do it. If you're not, let's rethink settlement.
We're on 18-month trial dockets, when they basically after tort reform, they were still dealing with COVID cases. And I'm like, that's our best case scenario, get in front of a judge. And you're probably going to get continued once, definitely, probably twice.
Right.
So, yeah, it's definitely there's got to be a lot of considerations made. You were kind of touching on it. I was telling you I wanted to dive into it more. I've gotten even the calls as well. I'll probably send them your way. As far as, hey, listen, we're getting a divorce. It didn't work out with me and so, but we're cool. Should we just do it ourselves? And I'm like, absolutely not. So discuss the pitfalls when it comes to trying to do your own divorce.
Yeah. Well, the first problem is, to put it in perspective, I spend probably half of my practice litigating post-judgment divorce cases.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay,
And
wow.
So a well-written final judgment will save you a substantial amount of money in the future. And so I encourage people settling their differences without lawyers. What I don't encourage is them writing up the agreement and asking for the court to enter a final judgment without a lawyer involved. So again, best case scenario is that two people come to an agreement, they go to a lawyer, they have the documents drafted, each have a lawyer review it with them to make sure it's fair, and then you're done, right? The nightmare scenario is, and the most shocking part to me is I have sometimes clients who are very wealthy, and they said, well, we just did it on our own. And I look at the documents they signed and I say, this doesn't say at all what you said it did. That's the problem. And so oftentimes we will get cases where it's immediately obvious that no lawyer was involved and it was an absolute mess, but they worked it out themselves. It saved them money in the beginning. It cost them a lot more money on the back end. And so that's the harm. Now, there are scenarios, of course, where two people get divorced, they live the rest of their life happily ever after, they never fight again. I'm not involved in that process, thank goodness. It's the people who have problems, right? And so I always encourage, if they call me and they want to know how to save money, I say have the kitchen table conversation, see if you can reach terms. If you can, we'll draft up an agreement and we'll see if we can get this done that way.
I saw, and I'm sure you saw it as well, I believe it was Anthony Edwards with the child support for $5,000 a month. And he was like, how much is that over 18 years? I think it was like $1,050,000 or something like that. He was like, here's a check.
Right.
Is that possible? And I'm not, I know there's, just give me a granular view because I know you may not know the case specifics. Is that possible to do that? Like you just cut a check and that's it?
It's possible, but it's
I know most people don't have the funds, obviously, but
it's fraught with problems. And so child support, it's not a set amount for a child's life. It's always subject to modification. And so for a lot of reasons, I would have never tell someone to prepay child support. $5,000 a month is not unheard of, believe it or not, and it's actually not reserved for celebrities. I've had high-level CEOs that had $5,000 a month in child support. Even if you have time sharing with your children, and that's one of the misconceptions I get is, well, why am I paying child support if I have 50-50 time? Well, it's just a formula, right? If you make more money, you got to pay child support. And so the problem with prepaying your child support is a lot of things could happen. Okay, so child support is based on income and time sharing. So let's say you make $1 million this year and your child support is $5,000 a month. If next year you make $0, your child support would be modified next year. And so, God forbid, a child passes away or something happens like that, your child support would terminate. And so now you've prepaid it to the other person for the next 18 years. That may not be the amount. It could be higher, it could be lower. And the other issue is you can't waive child support for your child because it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the child. So there are a lot of issues with that. It may keep you out of court if you prepay someone $1 million, or the money may run out in 6 months or a year and they want more. So I don't like it. I know why he did it. It made the headlines. It's a great story, but it's a bad idea legally.
So with these celebrity, that's what we hear about when we hear about divorces, these celebrity divorces with these massive estates and things. Why do those seem to take so much longer? Is it because maybe the fighting, the amount of assets, et cetera? Why do those seem to take so much longer and so many years longer than maybe a typical person's divorce?
Yeah, so anytime there are substantial assets and your life is in the spotlight, it can take longer. But believe it or not, I think a lot of the celebrity cases take less time because there's usually prenuptial agreements involved. If there's a prenuptial agreement, a well-written one, it can go very quickly because it's a contract, you're done, in and out. The Tom Brady example, right? Tom Brady gets married,
done.
3 months, you're done, never hear about it again. Or you have the Kanye divorce where it just drags out. And sometimes I think that's a publicity stunt.
Could be.
Right? Sometimes I think they're dragging it out just to make content, really. But celebrity aside, if you have two people with substantial assets, substantial income, it's going to take a long time unless the two parties agree on everything.
You mentioned prenuptial agreement. What do you think is stronger, a prenuptial agreement or a postnuptial agreement? And should you have both?
Yeah, you don't need both. I think a prenuptial agreement is stronger, in my opinion, because it's executed prior to the marriage, and a strong prenup requires full financial disclosure. And so prenup's got a really bad name, mostly from Kanye. what it is insurance. So when people say, well, why do I need a prenup? I say, well, do you have life insurance? Yeah, of course. You're not planning on dying, are you? No. Well, no one's planning on getting divorced. It's insurance, and it's a predetermined outcome. And so a lot of the misconceptions about prenuptial agreements are that you get nothing. And it's actually quite the opposite in most cases. I've done deals where my client, who was the spouse without the money, got a very good deal and a predetermined deal upon a divorce in exchange for not fighting, essentially, right? Saving the attorney's fees down the road, save the fight. But a well-written prenup that's executed by two good attorneys with full financial disclosure is very, very difficult to set aside. The problem is if you have a prenuptial agreement that you print off online, may or may not have had this exact scenario, you print it offline, and on the day of the wedding you say, hey, please sign this. Yeah, no problem. And now 10 years later you're litigating this. That's a problem. And that actually usually costs more money than if you didn't have one. And so postnuptial agreement is effectively the same exact thing executed after the marriage. And again, a well-written postnuptial agreement, in my opinion, it should be just as good. But it's oftentimes more difficult to obtain because now you're already married. And so in a prenuptial agreement situation, you want to execute it well before the marriage. My rule is 30 to 60 days minimum before the wedding date. And so that there's no question of any duress or coercion. The day of the wedding or the day
and then
before,
two lawyers involved is always very much recommended as well. So there's no conflict. Yeah, of course.
Two lawyers involved. It's all recorded.
Meaning one for each side.
One for each side, yeah. And that's another misconception is, can one lawyer draft a prenuptial agreement for both parties? And the answer is no. What you need to make sure you have in a prenuptial agreement situation is two people, consenting adults, aware of the finances, each have their own counsel. It's two people, again, you're two business partners making a contract. And it doesn't feel that way because everything's lovey-dovey. You got the wedding planned.
Love.
Right, you're going on a honeymoon. And a lot of times, what I don't want is someone closing their eyes and signing the paper and saying, everything's great. I don't want that. I want to make sure they understand.
He promised he'd take care of me.
Right, right. Yeah. And I wanted them to know what they're waiving. And so when we sign a prenuptial agreement, I ask those questions. You understand you're waiving your rights to this, 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 and this. And if they say yes and they're, everything else as well, then you should be fine.
Tell me what you talking about after the divorce process, and, kind of, I guess, a two-part question. We could dive in deeper. Do you give any advice about telling people or I guess advising people how to move on to this new chapter and how to kind of let this go? Not let it go. And I don't want to sound, distasteful or anything like that. Yeah. And what are some things you would advise to keep them from going back to court?
The best thing you can do, if you have children, for example, in Florida, you're required to have a parenting plan of who spends what days with the children, including holidays, things like that. The best thing you can do as two parents is put that parenting plan in the drawer, never look at it again, work things out amongst yourselves, coordinate a schedule. Kids' lives are chaotic. And if there are two type of people that need to stick to a schedule, that's fine. But oftentimes that creates problems because it's impossible to predict what's coming next over the next 10 years. Right? You have an 8-year-old, you got 10 years to co-parent. And I tell people the best thing you can do is communicate, use the parenting plan as guidance, but communicate with the other person, be flexible, think about your child first. Now you have the other extremes, which I know as soon as the case is over, that they are never going to get along, they're never going to communicate. Well, then I tell them, use the parenting plan as your guide, stick to it, try to be flexible, but be firm. Right, and it depends on who we're dealing with, right? And so, but best case scenario is you just have two people who can focus on their children and continue to live, a good life for the children. If you don't have children, I say, look, forget about it, move on, right? There's no children involved. There's no reason why you should have any interaction with that person. Don't post about it on Facebook. Don't tell your friends and family.
Don't. Yeah. Do not. Just don't post anything. Car accidents, crimes, divorces. Just don't even go on social media.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
I tell it, post as if the judge is reading it over your shoulder every time. Same with text messages. Text messages feel...
The insurance company's not looking... No, they're looking at them all. Yeah. They hire fancy investigators. They're looking at all your posts. Yeah. Your bench presses, your long hikes, your climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. They're looking at all of it.
Right. Yeah. And even text messages feel very intimate. They're not.
No.
You get divorced, I subpoena them.
Yes.
Now we read them in court loudly for everyone to hear. And so it's not to scare anyone off. It's just say, hey, when you get ready to go through this process, you're under the spotlight. You got to be careful.
Absolutely. Switching a little bit of gears about you and, just kind of, living the best life. And that's really a lot of what this podcast is about. Mm-hmm. Number one, I ask everybody, when did you feel like you were successful?
I think I felt it was probably pretty recently, to be honest. Making partner at my law firm.
Congratulations.
Huge success.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's massive for anybody.
Everyone who goes to law school watches the movies. You want to be a partner at a firm. But if you use that as your measure and that's it, well, then you make partner and it's great. And then it's, okay, well, now what? I'm a partner. Yeah. So for me, I felt successful when I could start doing things with my family without stressing about what it might cost.
It's so cool.
Right. And when my wife says, hey, I want to go to Disney, right, I'm not just going to totally ignore the cost, but I'm saying, okay, well, let's look at it. We can get the nicer hotel, right? We can make experiences for our children. And it's because, as I mentioned before, we have 2 children who are adopted. And when you adopt children, I think it's even more special in terms of giving them experiences, right? Because there are 2 children you didn't bring into this world. So I always feel it's very important to give them great experiences. And so once I can do those things with my children, once I can not stress every weekend about what's coming up at work next week, right, and actually enjoy my time, to me, that's success.
I worked on Sunday, so obviously, we both do a lot of marketing, and I worked on Sunday. I had a depot early Monday morning, and I was heading, instead of going to the main office, I was going to one of our satellite locations, and then I was going to head home a little early, and I called my wife and I said, hey, do you guys want to go do dinner at Disney? It's, we can do it for an hour. And it was like, I'm going to Disney on a Monday. Yeah. It was the coolest thing, and I knew everything was fine. And then the other thing, I was talking to my partners late last night, and I was like, how rad is it that, I think, 2 of them were in trial. This week it was on a commercial case, unrelated, and everything ran swimmingly. And all the pieces fit together. And I said, it's little things like weeks like this that it's just so exciting, when everything's clicking.
Yeah.
How do you deal with the high stress? You have some clients that, like we've hit on multiple times, are in a very difficult time in their life. They're probably calling, sometimes yelling, screaming, crying, emotional. How do you deal with that stress, and what do you do?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying I've always had sort of a gift of not stressing about even big things.
Well, right? Shame on you.
Which,
no, I'm just kidding.
For some reason, it's always been kind of
That's awesome.
It's always been kind of my best worst trait. If you're married to me, it's probably not a great thing all the time, because sometimes there's big problems. I'm like, oh, it's fine. Like, we'll figure it out, right? So I've always sort of had that demeanor of try not to be too up and down. And so I think family law was a natural fit for me, because I don't take the work home, with some exceptions, right? There are some cases that keep me up at night because I want the best for my client, and things are just not going their way, or it's just unfair. That's the things that keep me up at night. But for the most part, I try not to take it home, right? Early in my practice, I even made a rule for myself that I was going to change out of my suit at the office and drive home in casual clothes.
Wow. Okay.
Because mentally, for me, I'm done, right? If I get out of my suit, I change my mindset. I'm done with work for the day. I try to set boundaries. Very early in my practice, I stopped having pop-ups from Outlook, from my email. Don't have them. They don't pop up on my phone when I'm on the weekend, things like that. And I tell my clients, I give some of my clients my cell phone, the ones I trust, the ones I think aren't going to abuse it. But I tell even those people, I tell them, hey, if you text me on a Saturday, don't be offended if I don't text you back, right? It's work. If I think it needs to wait till Monday, it'll wait till Monday. If it's an emergency, I'll deal with it. But setting boundaries. That's the biggest way I deal with the stress, because when you're in the office, you're in the weeds of it. It can be stressful, but separating that from my home life, because my kids and my wife deserve to have the best me at home, and I'm trying not to end up on the other side of my desk.
I've gotten to the point now. Obviously somebody has to take every call, on the weekends, because we want to, one, keep clients happy, and 2, if that's an 18-wheeler accident, they're going to call somebody else.
Right.
So what I've done is made sure that I'm transparent with clients, similar to you said, if we're at Disney or something like that. Hey, listen, we're at Disney when we, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. When we sit down for lunch at noon, I'm going to call you back. Or when I put the kids down for a nap at the hotel, I'm going to give you a call back. I said, cool. Yeah, no problem. Right. And that seemed to work out with me as well. Just like you said, just setting boundaries, having open communication with people. And I think, and I would love your opinion. I think the practice of law has changed so much that lawyers are okay with sharing like their personal lives, which is really cool. I mean, you think about attorneys 20, 30 years, it's, the ivory tower and the suits and the, and it's kind of cool that clients get to know us a little bit. And I think it makes it that much better of an experience and makes it a little bit smoother through conversations like, well, they're a real person too, or I know they have a wife and kids or a significant other and kids and things like that. So I do appreciate how the legal practice, the attorney-client relationship has evolved over the years.
Yeah, I think COVID was the best thing to ever happen to the practice of law. At first, it didn't seem that way. But since COVID, since 2020...
We're more efficient.
We do a lot of things on Zoom. Half of my clients, I may never meet in person. It's just more efficient. It allows us to have more clients and do better work for people when I'm not sitting at the courthouse for hours at a time. But going to the personal side of things, it's a little difficult in family law because when I have clients in my office, I don't have any pictures of my wedding day and things like that. I try not to be that guy to say, look how great my life is while you're going through stress. But if there is an open door for me to have conversations with people about real life, about the stress of raising kids, that is why I love doing family law because it is practical. There are some intricacies that you have to deal with, but for the most part, you have a human being across from you who has real life problems that you can understand. And so being able to meet them right there, to share with my life with them, if I think it's a good opportunity to do that, that is my favorite part, the personal aspect. And I think if it ever got to the point where it felt transactional, I don't know that I would enjoy it.
I love and I'm sure you can attest to this as well, the clients that do keep in touch with me on social media or, post that they, got, for lack of better terms, got married or got engaged or, they were dating somebody at the time or, they bought that new car or they did this or that. I love seeing that. And I encourage people to stay in touch with me over the years. A lot of times we're in the trenches with each other for, call it 6 months on a fast track to probably sometimes 18 months, 2 years, if not longer. So I think it's as important for the attorney to find a good fit as it is for the client to find a good fit. And don't feel like just because your friend said, hey, call this guy, doesn't mean, maybe call one or two other people. Unless you call Sterling or Kevin, then you're good there. It's done there.
Right.
But don't be afraid to find that right fit because this is your life. It's very important.
Yeah. Early in my practice, I wanted to take every case. I'm sure you can attest to this. There's like...
Been there, done that.
Oh, yes. I try to change my style to meet their style. And they want me to be more aggressive, so I'm more aggressive. And over the years, you realize it doesn't work, right? Because if you don't mesh well with a client, especially in a divorce case, you're their advocate in court, right? And it's not that you want to match their energy, but you want to have a good relationship with them so you can properly explain to the court what's going on. But one of my favorite stories, I had a lady who was one of the nicest clients, one of my favorite clients, and she just told me during the divorce, I just want enough money to pay off my house and build a pool. Great. I think we can make that happen.
Love
right?
you.
Right. Awesome. And so it was so cool. Like 6 or 8 months later, she messages me a picture of her pool. And like, that was such a full circle moment for me because I'm like, it's all about expectations. It's all about desires. If I spend my time trying to get her more than she wants, she's not going to be happy with it, right? I'm going to spend more money than I need to. I need to know what she wants. You need to know what the client wants and fight for them. If you can get it, you get it. And then they're much happier at the end of the case. There's no need to steamroll every issue and unearth every problem if all your client wants is enough money to build a pool.
I had a lady very similar. I've done this a couple of times. They had their car was totaled rather. And they went and I think she was borrowing her mom's car or something like that. I mean, she was going through it for like a good year trying to figure out transportation. I dropped off her check at the Hyundai dealership where she was buying a brand new car, which is really cool. Any other stories that you can share from, remarkable stories or anything like that? I know with attorney-client privilege, we obviously have to be careful, or be respectful.
Yeah, nothing in particular comes to mind, but again, it's those stories where the client calls me 6 months later, a year later, and says, you were so right. I am so much happier now. I'm so glad we didn't spend the time fighting for that one little thing. I'm in this position now. I'm so much happier. And that makes me so happy because in the moment, right, I spend a lot of time trying to convince people to settle their differences, move on, start a new life, go to the next chapter. And in the heat of the moment, a lot of people want to fight. And so sometimes that can be perceived as, well, you don't want to fight for me. It's like, it's not that I don't want to fight for you. This is what I do for a living, right? I get paid for this. I'd be happy to go to court, but I don't think you're going to be any happier. And so then once they settle and then months down the road, they realize, oh, I'm so glad I went this route, because they see their friends who might be in the same situation and are still fighting it in court who are miserable.
And that's where I was going to go with, I actually wrote it down why it came back to me. Yeah. Aggressive attorney. I hate that phrase so much. Yeah. You don't want aggressive. Right. You want efficient. You want somebody that's going to advocate for you in an efficient manner. Right. I can be super aggressive. Yeah. We can do this for 2 years, and like you said, and we can hire experts, and I can go in front of a jury and put on a whole song and dance about, how your life was affected and things like that.
Right.
What does that look like, though?
Yeah.
If there's only $100,000 policy that's with somebody that's not collectible, and I spend $20,000, $30,000 on experts, and I could have got you they already offered the 100. What are we doing? Right. And very much so in your business, it's like, oh, I can be super aggressive. Right. We can run up $100,000 in attorney's fees real quick, fam. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
absolutely, and that's one of the biggest issues I see in my initial calls with clients. So we do free consults.
Are you a fighter?
Right. I need a bulldog, and usually what that means is they've already had 3 lawyers. And they weren't satisfied. They weren't satisfied with how aggressive the lawyers were. And I have, again, at this point in my practice, I have no problem telling people, look, if that's what you want, I'm not the guy. And it's not that I can't fight, right? And a lot of people, they see me in mediation.
Oh, you won't?
Right.
Yeah.
And then they see me in court and they're like, oh man, you tore them apart. And it's like, yeah, I can do it. I have no problem doing it. Is it going to be worth it? So, for example, in a divorce, there's 2 problems with being super aggressive. Number one, the money is coming out of your bank account or a collective share of bank accounts. There's only one pot of money to get money out of. There's no insurance company, right? There's no deep pockets unless the parties have deep pockets. The other problem is if you have kids, so what you're telling me is you want me to go in there and rip that person apart in public in front of a judge and whoever else shows up in the courtroom, but you're going to spend the next 15 years co-parenting with them, and you think that's just going to go perfectly fine. After this whole charade, we put on the show again in court, we yell, we pull out text messages, we pull out Facebook posts. They're going to spend the next 15 years thinking about what happened, not thinking about what's best for the children.
It's human nature.
It's human nature. And so that's where I caution people. And there are cases where we need to do that, right? Where the other side is completely unreasonable, completely irrational. We need to bring this to the forefront of the court. But I will be honest with you, that is probably 1% of cases need that.
I've had people tell me in the past, and I will say to what your point, to your point rather, when dealing with adjusters in our business and defense attorneys, I want them to like me. I want them to go to their supervisors and ask them for the most amount of money in the quickest period of time to get you to be able to move on to the next chapter. I want defense attorneys to respect me and respect what we do and understand when, I call Kevin and pick up the phone, he's going to be even keeled for the most part. And if I do push him over the edge, then I must have done something and vice versa. But you want somebody that has a good working relationship. So be careful with that. Like I said, when you're doing any type of consultation with a lawyer and you're like, I want aggressive and a bulldog. And they're like, absolutely, we'll take them to the end, because the end may involve the end of your checkbook too.
Exactly.
So
exactly. And to your point, sometimes in cases they say, well, you're being too nice to the other lawyer. You're being too nice to the other party. The problem with being mean to the other side is you're going to clam up, right?
Yeah,
they're going to retract. They're going to fight. And if you back someone into a corner, that's all they're going to do. They're going to fight. And I know people want their day, right? And I tell people all the time, we can get your day in court. You're entitled to it. But are you going to be any happier then than you are now? And the answer is probably no. And so let's rethink that situation.
Well, yeah. And the Beanie Baby meme?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Listen, I wanted to end this podcast. If you haven't seen it yet, go look at the divorce Beanie Baby meme because it is absolutely hilarious. Yeah. And that's what happens when you don't get a fantastic attorney like Sterling that's going to manage your expectations and lead you in the right direction. So with that, I would be, again, remiss if I didn't ask you to like and subscribe. I'm going to make sure that I put Sterling's contact details in the description. So if you have any questions or need to speak with him, his firm can definitely do a great job and take care of you. As always, I appreciate you guys joining us. Thank you, my friend, for being here. And as always, we end with, it is not an accident that Sterling is as successful as he is. See you soon.
Thank you, friend.
Be good.